The fastest way to embarrass yourself is to underestimate a quiet man. Nobody in Blackstone Correctional Facility knew who said it first, but by the end of that day, everyone wished they had listened. The trouble started during lunch. The cafeteria was packed with more than 200 inmates moving through lines, carrying trays, and searching for empty seats. Voices echoed off concrete walls. Plastic trays scraped across metal tables. It looked like any ordinary afternoon inside the prison. At one corner of the room sat Elijah Carter, a 58-year-old black inmate who had arrived only 3 days earlier. He sat alone, eating slowly and saying almost nothing. Most people barely noticed him. His prison uniform looked slightly loose on his lean frame. His hair was gray around the edges. He moved calmly, never rushing, never drawing attention to himself. To most inmates, Elijah looked like exactly the kind of prisoner who would spend his sentence trying to stay invisible. Ryan Cole saw something different. Ryan was one of the most feared inmates in Blackstone. Tall, loud, and constantly surrounded by followers, he enjoyed making examples out of newcomers. Every housing unit had stories about him. Some were exaggerated, some were not. What mattered was that people usually stepped aside when Ryan entered a room. That afternoon, Ryan noticed Elijah sitting alone. He smirked. "Look at this guy," he said to the men at his table. "He looks like he is attending a church picnic instead of prison." Several inmates laughed. Elijah continued eating. Ryan stood up. "I do not think he heard me." More laughter followed. Nearby inmates exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen this pattern before. Ryan spotted a target, then turned humiliation into entertainment. Slowly, he picked up a carton of milk from his tray and began walking toward Elijah. The cafeteria grew quieter. Even inmates who pretended not to care started watching. Officer Daniel Mercer stood near one of the exits monitoring the room. He noticed Ryan moving, but did not intervene. Nothing had happened yet. Ryan stopped beside Elijah's table. "You know," he said loudly, "most people introduce themselves when they arrive." Elijah looked up calmly. "Good afternoon." The response triggered more laughter. Ryan shook his head. "That is all you have?" Elijah simply nodded. Ryan looked around the room as if performing for an audience. "This place is unbelievable." Then, before anyone expected it, he tipped the milk carton. White liquid spilled across Elijah's shoulder, shirt, and tray. The cafeteria instantly fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every movement seemed to freeze. Hundreds of eyes locked onto Elijah Carter. Some expected anger. Others expected fear. Most expected something. Instead, Elijah looked down at his soaked uniform. He picked up a napkin. He calmly wiped milk from his sleeve. Then he looked at Ryan and spoke in a quiet voice. "I hope that made your day better." The silence became even heavier. Ryan's smile faded slightly. That was not the reaction he wanted. "That is it?" Ryan asked. Elijah folded the napkin neatly. "That is it." Around the cafeteria, inmates exchanged confused looks. Officer Mercer frowned from across the room. Even he expected more emotion than that. Ryan laughed loudly, trying to regain control of the moment. "You really are scared." Elijah stood slowly, lifted his tray, and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he looked directly at Ryan. There was no anger in his expression, no fear, no challenge, just calm certainty. For some reason, that unsettled Ryan more than any argument could have. Elijah carried his tray toward the return station and disappeared through the exit without another word. The cafeteria remained unusually quiet long after he left. One older inmate sitting near the back shook his head slowly. Another stared toward the door as if he had just witnessed something important. Officer Mercer continued watching the hallway where Elijah had disappeared. Across the room, Ryan returned to his table and forced a grin, but the laughter around him sounded weaker than before. Nobody understood it yet, but the milk was not what people would remember. What they would remember was the look on Elijah Carter's face. Because for the first time that day, several people had the same strange thought. Maybe Ryan Cole had just picked the wrong prisoner. By the next morning, nearly everyone inside Blackstone Correctional Facility was talking about the cafeteria incident. Stories traveled fast in prison, but this one moved differently. Most humiliations ended with arguments, threats, or days of tension. This one ended with something nobody could explain. Elijah Carter had simply walked away. That should have made him look weak. Instead, it had the opposite effect. During breakfast, small groups of inmates quietly discussed the strange encounter. Some believed Elijah had been scared. Others disagreed. There had been something unusual about the way he responded. Fear usually looked different. Fear avoided eye contact. Fear rushed away. Fear tried to disappear. Elijah had done none of those things. He had looked directly at Ryan Cole and spoken with complete calm. That detail stayed in people's minds. Ryan noticed the conversations too. He sat at his usual table surrounded by followers, pretending everything was normal. Outwardly, he laughed and joked. Inwardly, he felt irritated. The attention was supposed to be on him. Instead, people seemed more interested in the old inmate who had done almost nothing. Across the room, Elijah sat alone with a book beside his tray. He ate quietly, occasionally turning a page. He looked exactly the same as he had the day before. If the incident bothered him, nobody could tell. Officer Daniel Mercer observed the room from his normal position near the entrance. His eyes drifted toward Elijah several times. He could not understand why the older inmate seemed completely unaffected. Most new arrivals spent their first weeks trying to establish alliances or avoid trouble. Elijah appeared interested in neither. After breakfast, inmates moved toward their assigned work details. Elijah was assigned to a maintenance support crew responsible for organizing storage areas and cleaning common spaces. The assignment was simple, yet within an hour, something unexpected happened. A supervisor entered one of the storage rooms and stopped in surprise. Equipment that had been disorganized for months was suddenly arranged neatly. Supplies were grouped logically. Labels faced outward. Inventory lists matched shelf locations. The entire room functioned more efficiently than before. Who did this? The supervisor asked. Another inmate pointed toward Elijah. The older man was quietly sweeping a corner. The supervisor walked over. You reorganized everything? Elijah nodded. It seemed easier that way. The supervisor looked around the room again. You did all this in less than an hour? Elijah smiled slightly. There was not much to it. The supervisor shook his head in disbelief before walking away. Nearby inmates exchanged curious glances. It was another small thing. Yet it added to the growing sense that Elijah was not quite what he appeared to be. Later that afternoon, Ryan entered the recreation yard expecting the usual attention. Instead, he found several inmates discussing Elijah again. That only increased his frustration. Spotting an opportunity, Ryan approached a bench where Elijah sat reading beneath the afternoon sun. Several inmates nearby immediately became quiet. Ryan folded his arms. You know, people are starting to think you are somebody important. Elijah looked up from his book. Are they? Ryan smirked. Maybe you should tell them who you are. Elijah closed the book carefully and placed it beside him. I already know who I am. The answer caught Ryan off guard. Around them, a few inmates exchanged looks. Ryan forced a laugh. You always talk like that. Elijah smiled politely. Only when someone asks a question. More quiet laughter came from nearby benches. Ryan's expression tightened. Once again, the conversation was not going the way he expected. For several seconds, he stood there searching for another remark. Then he shook his head and walked away. As he disappeared across the yard, one older inmate sitting nearby watched him leave. His eyes returned to Elijah. Something about the older man's face suddenly seemed familiar. Not familiar from prison. Familiar from somewhere else. Somewhere much older. Somewhere important. The inmate continued staring long after Elijah reopened his book. A memory was trying to surface. A name. A place. A face from years ago. He could not quite reach it yet. But for the first time since Elijah arrived at Blackstone, someone was beginning to suspect that the quiet prisoner carried a history far bigger than anyone imagined. That night, the older inmate who had been watching Elijah Carter in the recreation yard could not stop thinking about him. His name was Thomas Walker, a 62-year-old inmate who had spent years inside Blackstone. Before prison, Thomas had served in the military. Most people did not know that because he rarely talked about his past. Yet the moment he saw Elijah sitting quietly with that book, a distant memory had stirred somewhere in the back of his mind. The posture looked familiar. The calm looked familiar. Even the way Elijah observed people without appearing to observe them felt strangely recognizable. The next morning, Thomas arrived early for breakfast. He scanned the cafeteria until he found Elijah seated at the same table near the wall. Once again, the older inmate sat alone. Once again, he appeared completely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. Thomas carried his tray across the room and stopped beside the table. Mind if I sit here? Elijah looked up and smiled politely. Not at all. Thomas took the seat opposite him. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Then Thomas extended his hand. Thomas Walker. Elijah shook it. Elijah Carter. The handshake lasted only a second, but something about it deepened Thomas's curiosity. Elijah's grip was relaxed, controlled, confident. Not the grip of someone trying to prove strength. The grip of someone who did not need to. You settling in? Thomas asked. Elijah nodded. As well as anyone can. Most people would not be doing as well after what happened 2 days ago. Elijah smiled faintly. People have poured worse things than milk during my lifetime. Thomas studied him carefully. The answer sounded simple, yet there was something beneath it. Something earned through experience. Before Thomas could ask another question, several inmates entered the cafeteria, discussing Ryan Cole. Apparently, Ryan had spent much of the previous evening complaining that people were giving Elijah too much attention. The irony amused Thomas. Ryan had tried to embarrass Elijah publicly, yet now Ryan seemed frustrated that everyone kept talking about the man he targeted. Across the room, Ryan noticed Thomas sitting with Elijah. His expression darkened briefly before he looked away. Elijah appeared not to notice. After breakfast, Thomas found himself thinking about the conversation throughout the day. The more he replayed it, the stronger the feeling became. He had seen someone like Elijah before. Not personally, not exactly, but somewhere during his military years. Later that afternoon, Thomas visited the prison library. The facility maintained a modest collection of books, magazines, and archive publications donated over the years. Most inmates ignored the older materials stored in back rooms. Thomas usually did too. Yet something pushed him toward them. He spent nearly an hour searching through shelves without knowing exactly what he was looking for. Finally, he sat down with several military publications from decades earlier. At first, nothing stood out. Then he found a photograph accompanying an article about leadership training. The image was old and slightly faded. The faces were younger. The uniforms belonged to another era. Thomas stared at the page. One man in the photograph looked surprisingly familiar. He leaned closer. The resemblance was not perfect. The image was too old for certainty. Yet the eyes looked similar. The posture looked similar. The calm expression looked very similar. Thomas felt a chill run through him. He turned the page, hoping to find more information, but the article continued on to a section that had been damaged years earlier. The rest was missing. Frustrated, he closed the publication and sat quietly. Across Blackstone, Elijah continued his normal routine, completely unaware of the questions beginning to form around him. Meanwhile, Ryan Cole noticed something else. More inmates were starting to greet Elijah respectfully, not because they knew who he was, because they sensed there was something unusual about him. For the first time since Elijah arrived, Ryan began feeling something unfamiliar. It was not fear. Not yet. It was uncertainty. And inside a place like Blackstone, uncertainty often marked the beginning of much bigger revelations. The feeling followed Thomas Walker for the rest of the week. Every time he saw Elijah Carter, the same question returned. Where had he seen someone like him before? It was not simply the calm attitude. Plenty of inmates learned to stay quiet. It was the combination of things. The way Elijah observed a room without appearing distracted. The way he carried himself. The way he never seemed surprised by anything. Most people inside Blackstone reacted to prison. Elijah seemed to study it. On Thursday afternoon, Thomas found Elijah sitting in the library reading a thick history book near the back wall. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows and stretched across the floor. The library was mostly empty. Thomas approached carrying a stack of magazines. Mind if I join you again? Elijah smiled. You are starting to make this a habit. Thomas laughed and took a seat. For several minutes, they read quietly. Eventually, Thomas lowered his magazine. Were you in the military? Elijah turned a page before answering. Why do you ask? Thomas smiled. That is not a no. Elijah looked up briefly. And that is not an answer. Thomas laughed again. He was beginning to enjoy these conversations. Most people tried to dominate discussions. Elijah never did. Somehow he always answered questions without revealing very much. I served years ago, Thomas said. Not anything remarkable, but long enough to recognize certain habits. Elijah nodded politely. Military service teaches useful habits. Thomas noticed Elijah had not denied anything. Before he could continue, another inmate entered the library and greeted Elijah respectfully. The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but Thomas noticed something interesting. More people seemed comfortable approaching Elijah now. The change had happened gradually, yet it was undeniable. Meanwhile, Across the facility, Ryan Cole was becoming increasingly frustrated. The cafeteria incident was supposed to establish dominance. Instead, it had produced the opposite result. The more Ryan tried to dismiss Elijah, the more curious people became. During recreation, Ryan sat with several followers discussing the situation. "He is just an old guy," Ryan insisted. "People are acting like he is some kind of celebrity." One inmate shrugged. "Maybe they are curious." Ryan rolled his eyes. "About what?" Nobody answered. That silence irritated him even more. Later that day, Officer Daniel Mercer experienced something unusual. A maintenance supervisor stopped him in a hallway. "That new inmate, Carter, is impressive." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "Impressive how?" The supervisor explained how Elijah had improved several storage areas, corrected inventory issues, and identified mistakes that had gone unnoticed for months. "He sees details other people miss," the supervisor said. Mercer thanked him and continued walking, but the conversation stayed with him. Everywhere he turned, someone seemed to have another story about Elijah. None of the stories were dramatic. That was what made them interesting. Elijah was not trying to impress anyone, yet people kept noticing him anyway. The following morning brought another small surprise. During breakfast, a disagreement developed between two inmates waiting in line. The situation never became serious, but voices grew louder. Before staff needed to intervene, Elijah quietly spoke to both men. Nobody nearby heard exactly what he said. Yet within seconds, the tension disappeared. The two inmates returned to normal conversation and continued through the line. Several witnesses stared in confusion. Officer Mercer happened to observe the entire exchange from a distance. He frowned. Most inmates struggled to calm arguments. Elijah seemed able to lower tension almost effortlessly. Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to the library archives. The damaged military publication still bothered him. He searched through boxes of old magazines and donated newsletters hoping to find another clue. Nearly 2 hours passed before he discovered a partially preserved Veterans Association bulletin. The pages were yellowed with age. Most readers would have ignored it immediately. Thomas almost did. Then he noticed a photograph attached to an article about a leadership conference held decades earlier. Several names appeared beneath the image. One of them made Thomas sit upright. The last name was Carter. The first name was difficult to read because part of the page had been torn away. Thomas leaned closer. His pulse quickened. The photograph was blurry, and certainty remained impossible. Yet for the second time that week, he found himself staring at a younger face that looked remarkably similar to Elijah. Across Blackstone, Elijah continued his routine completely unaware that pieces of his past were beginning to surface. And somewhere deep inside Thomas Walker's mind, a mystery was slowly transforming into a serious investigation. By the beginning of the second week, rumors about Elijah Carter had spread through nearly every housing unit in Blackstone. Nobody knew exactly where the rumors started. Some traced them back to the cafeteria incident. Others pointed to stories from the maintenance department. A few mentioned the library. Regardless of the source, the result was the same. People were talking about the quiet inmate who never seemed rattled by anything. What made the rumors unusual was the lack of dramatic details. Nobody claimed Elijah was dangerous. Nobody claimed he controlled people. Instead, inmates kept sharing small observations. He noticed problems before they happened. He remembered details others forgot. He treated everyone with the same calm respect regardless of status. The collection of tiny stories created a larger mystery. Ryan Cole hated it. Every day seemed to bring another conversation about Elijah. During lunch one afternoon, Ryan sat surrounded by his usual group when he overheard two inmates discussing the older man at a nearby table. One of them mentioned how Elijah had helped reorganize a work assignment schedule. Another mentioned how he had quietly resolved a disagreement between inmates without raising his voice. Ryan slammed his plastic cup onto the table. You would think he was running the place the way people talk about him. The inmates nearby immediately became quiet. Ryan noticed and rolled his eyes. He is still just another prisoner. Yet even as he said it, he sounded less certain than before. Across the cafeteria, Elijah continued eating lunch completely unaware of the conversation. Or perhaps he was aware and simply chose not to react. It was often difficult to tell. Later that afternoon, Thomas Walker returned to the library archives. The veteran's bulletin he discovered continued bothering him. The partial name beneath the photograph seemed too coincidental. Thomas spent nearly 3 hours searching through old materials. Most of what he found proved useless. Then he uncovered another reference. It appeared inside a donated newsletter from a military support organization. The article focused on leadership recognition and community service. Once again, part of the document had been damaged by age. Yet one sentence remained visible. It mentioned an Elijah Carter receiving recognition for exceptional leadership following military service. Thomas stared at the page. The article offered few details, but the timeline matched. The age matched. The name matched. For the first time, Thomas felt confident he was not imagining connections that did not exist. Something significant was hidden inside Elijah's past. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer experienced another puzzling interaction. During a routine inspection, he found Elijah helping a newer inmate complete paperwork related to educational programs. The younger inmate looked frustrated before Elijah arrived. 10 minutes later, the forms were complete and the inmate appeared relieved. Mercer watched from a distance. As the younger inmate walked away, Mercer approached. "You seem to spend a lot of time helping people." Elijah shrugged lightly. "Sometimes people need help." Mercer folded his arms. "Most inmates focus on themselves." Elijah smiled. "That usually makes life harder." The answer lingered in Mercer's mind long after the conversation ended. It seemed simple, yet it reflected a perspective he rarely encountered inside prison walls. That evening, Ryan made another attempt to provoke Elijah during recreation. He approached a group gathered around a bench where Elijah sat reading. "You know what is funny?" Ryan asked loudly. Nobody answered. People are treating this guy like some kind of legend. A few inmates shifted uncomfortably. Elijah calmly turned a page. Ryan laughed. Maybe he was a secret president or something. Still no reaction. The lack of response frustrated Ryan more than any argument could have. Eventually, he walked away shaking his head. As soon as he disappeared, one inmate sitting nearby leaned toward Elijah. "How do you stay so calm?" Elijah closed the book and looked toward the sunset. "Most people give away too much control." The inmate frowned. "What does that mean?" Elijah smiled gently. "If someone can decide your emotions for you, then they control more than your day." Several inmates sat quietly thinking about the answer. Across the yard, Thomas watched the exchange. The more time he spent around Elijah, the more convinced he became that the older man had lived an extraordinary life before arriving at Blackstone. And somewhere beyond the rumors, beyond the clues, and beyond the faded photographs hidden in library archives, the truth was waiting to be discovered. As the days passed, the mystery surrounding Elijah Carter continued growing, not because he sought attention, but because unusual things kept happening around him. Inside Blackstone, people had begun expecting stories. Every few days, someone seemed to discover another small detail that made the quiet inmate harder to understand. Yet Elijah himself remained unchanged. He woke early, completed his assignments, read books, helped people when asked, then returned to his cell without complaint. The simplicity of his routine only deepened the curiosity. One Monday morning, the prison maintenance department encountered an unexpected problem. A delivery of supplies had arrived with several inventory discrepancies. Missing items appeared on paperwork. Listed quantities did not match actual contents. Supervisors spent nearly an hour trying to identify the source of the confusion. Several inmates stood nearby waiting for instructions. Elijah happened to be among them. After quietly observing the discussion for a few minutes, he walked toward one of the storage shelves. He studied several boxes before turning toward the supervisor. "I think the shipment was labeled correctly," he said. The supervisor frowned. "Then why do the numbers not match?" Elijah pointed toward a stack of containers. "Because part of the inventory was placed in the wrong section 3 days ago." The supervisor checked. Elijah was correct. Within minutes, the problem was solved. Several inmates exchanged surprised glances. The supervisor looked impressed. Elijah simply returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. Later that afternoon, Thomas Walker visited the library again. His search had become more focused. He was no longer looking for random clues. He was searching specifically for Elijah Carter. Unfortunately, most prison records were inaccessible, and many archived materials contained incomplete information. Still, Thomas refused to give up. While sorting through donated magazines, he found another veterans publication. Most of the issue focused on community events and charity programs. Near the back, however, a short article caught his attention. The article described a leadership seminar attended by former military personnel. One participant was identified as Elijah Carter. A small photograph accompanied the story. The image was clearer than the others Thomas had discovered. He stared at it for several seconds. There was no doubt now. The man in the photograph was Elijah. Younger, of course. Stronger. Yet unmistakably the same person. Thomas felt excitement building inside him. The discovery confirmed that Elijah had indeed served in the military. What remained unknown was how significant that service had been. Across the facility, Ryan Cole noticed something else changing. People had stopped laughing when he joked about Elijah. Not entirely, but enough to irritate him. The social balance was shifting. The old inmate who arrived as an easy target was gradually becoming someone others respected. Ryan could not understand why. He had seen tougher inmates, louder inmates, more intimidating inmates. Yet none generated the same reaction. During recreation, Ryan approached a group discussing Elijah's latest inventory discovery. "You all act like he solved a national crisis," Ryan said. One inmate shrugged. Nobody else figured it out. Ryan rolled his eyes. Maybe he got lucky. Before anyone could respond, Elijah walked past carrying a library book under one arm. Several inmates greeted him. Elijah greeted them back and continued walking. The interaction lasted only seconds, but Ryan noticed something important. The respect appeared genuine. Nobody was forcing it. That realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer continued observing from a distance. He had started paying closer attention to Elijah over the past week. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Wherever Elijah went, situations seemed to improve. Arguments calmed down. Tasks became more organized. Problems were solved. Yet the older inmate never sought credit. Mercer found that detail especially strange. Most people enjoyed recognition. Elijah appeared almost uncomfortable receiving it. That evening, Thomas finally decided to speak with Elijah directly. He found him in the library reading quietly near the same window where they often talked. Thomas sat down across from him and placed the Veterans magazine on the table. Elijah looked at the cover and smiled faintly. "You have been busy." Thomas laughed. "So it really is you." Elijah glanced at the photograph before closing the magazine gently. "That was a long time ago." Thomas leaned forward. "I think there is a lot more to this story." For a moment, Elijah looked out the window toward the fading evening light. Then he smiled. "Most stories are bigger than they appear." The answer only strengthened Thomas's determination. Because somewhere inside Blackstone Correctional Facility, a hidden past was slowly beginning to reveal itself, one clue at a time. The more Thomas Walker learned about Elijah Carter, the less everything made sense. By now, he had collected enough clues to confirm that Elijah's military service was real. The photographs were real. The leadership recognition articles were real. Yet none of them explained why a man with that kind of background had entered Blackstone Correctional Facility and chosen to live so quietly. Most people with impressive accomplishments spent years talking about them. Elijah spent his days organizing supply rooms and reading books. That contrast fascinated Thomas. One evening after dinner, he found Elijah sitting alone in the library. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Most inmates had already returned to their housing units, leaving the room unusually quiet. Thomas approached carrying another stack of archived materials. Elijah glanced at the papers and smiled knowingly. "Still searching?" Thomas laughed. "You are making it difficult to stop." Elijah closed his book. "And what have you found?" Thomas took a seat. "Enough to know you were not an ordinary soldier." For a moment, Elijah said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Very few soldiers are ordinary." The answer sounded simple, but Thomas recognized another careful response. Elijah acknowledged the statement without confirming anything specific. Before Thomas could continue, an older inmate entering the library suddenly stopped walking. His eyes locked onto Elijah. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he approached cautiously. "Excuse me," he said. Elijah looked up. The man's expression changed immediately. Surprise became certainty. "I knew it," the inmate whispered. Thomas leaned forward. "You know him?" The man nodded slowly without taking his eyes off Elijah. "Not personally." He hesitated. "But years ago, when I was still serving, there were stories." Elijah sighed softly. "Stories grow larger with time." The inmate shook his head. "Not those stories." The room fell silent. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Finally, a real lead. The older inmate sat down. I served at Fort Campbell years ago. Every once in a while, people would talk about certain training groups, certain instructors, certain teams. He looked directly at Elijah. Your name came up more than once. Thomas stared at Elijah in disbelief. Elijah simply folded his hands and listened. You were respected, the inmate continued. That is what I remember most. Everybody respected you. Elijah smiled faintly. That was a long time ago. The inmate nodded. Maybe, but some people are not forgotten. News of the conversation spread quickly through Blackstone. Prison rumors rarely remained secret for long. By the following morning, dozens of inmates had heard that someone from the military recognized Elijah. The details varied depending on who told the story, but the central idea remained consistent. The quiet inmate apparently had a much larger history than anyone originally believed. Ryan Cole heard the rumors too. At first he dismissed them. Then he noticed something troubling. Even inmates who normally avoided gossip seemed interested. During breakfast, several conversations stopped when Ryan approached. During recreation, people continued discussing Elijah after Ryan walked away. For the first time in years, Ryan felt something unfamiliar. He was losing control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer received another unexpected piece of information. A staff member responsible for educational programs mentioned Elijah during a meeting. According to the report, Elijah had voluntarily helped several inmates improve reading skills and prepare for certification tests. The results were measurable. Participation rates increased. Classroom conflicts decreased. Mercer listened quietly. Another positive report. Another example of Elijah improving situations without seeking recognition. Later that afternoon, Mercer observed Elijah from across the recreation yard. The older inmate sat beneath a shade structure reading, while several inmates nearby talked among themselves. Nobody appeared intimidated by him. Yet nobody treated him casually either. There was respect in the air now. Not because people feared Elijah, because they sensed depth beneath the surface. As sunset approached, Thomas found himself reviewing every clue collected so far. The picture remained incomplete, but one conclusion was becoming impossible to ignore. Elijah Carter was not merely a former soldier with leadership experience. Whatever role he once held, it had been significant enough that decades later people still remembered his name. And somewhere beyond the fragments of old articles, forgotten photographs, and fading military stories, the real truth was waiting to emerge. By the third week of Elijah Carter's time at Blackstone, curiosity had become impossible to contain. The rumors were no longer limited to a handful of inmates. They had spread into nearly every corner of the facility. Yet the strange part remained unchanged. Nobody could point to a dramatic event. Nobody claimed Elijah had threatened anyone or demanded respect. The fascination came from something much harder to explain. Every clue suggested a remarkable past, while every action suggested complete humility. The contradiction kept people talking. Thomas Walker felt closer than ever to finding answers. The conversation with the older veteran in the library had confirmed one important fact. Elijah's name had carried weight long before he arrived at Blackstone. That realization pushed Thomas back into the archives with renewed determination. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of donated military newsletters, he discovered something different. Unlike the damaged publications he had found before, this document was preserved surprisingly well. The article focused on a reunion event attended by former service members. Most of the names meant nothing to Thomas. Then he reached a section describing honored guests. His eyes immediately stopped on a familiar name. Elijah Carter. Thomas leaned closer. The article did not reveal sensitive details, but it described Elijah as a respected leader whose career had influenced countless service members. A short quote from an event organizer stood out. It referred to Elijah as someone who led by example and earned trust in the most demanding environments imaginable. Thomas read the sentence 3 times. His pulse quickened. This was bigger than anything he had found before. Meanwhile, across the facility, Ryan Cole was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. He would never admit it publicly, but the situation had begun affecting him. Every attempt to dismiss Elijah seemed to backfire. Every joke felt weaker than the last. Even some of Ryan's closest associates had stopped showing interest whenever he brought Elijah up. One evening during recreation, Ryan noticed something that bothered him even more. Officer Daniel Mercer stopped to speak briefly with Elijah near the walking track. The conversation appeared respectful. There was no special treatment, no obvious favoritism. Yet Ryan recognized something unusual. Mercer listened carefully whenever Elijah spoke. That was not how most officers interacted with inmates. The observation lingered in Ryan's mind long after the conversation ended. Officer Mercer himself was experiencing a gradual shift in perspective. Since Elijah's arrival, he had heard reports from supervisors, educational staff, maintenance personnel, and inmates. The pattern remained remarkably consistent. Elijah improved situations without seeking recognition. He solved problems quietly. He treated everyone respectfully. Mercer had worked in corrections long enough to recognize genuine character when he saw it. The growing mystery surrounding Elijah only made those qualities more noticeable. Later that week, Thomas finally decided to ask a more direct question. He found Elijah in the library organizing returned books onto a cart. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. Elijah smiled. "You usually do." Thomas laughed. "Fair point." He hesitated briefly. "How many people did you lead?" Elijah paused before placing another book on the shelf. "Why does that matter?" "Because every article says the same thing," Thomas replied. "Leadership, respect, responsibility." Elijah considered the question. Then he answered carefully. "The number is not important. What matters is whether people felt valued while you were responsible for them." Thomas stared at him. Once again, Elijah had answered without really answering. Yet somehow the response revealed even more than a specific number would have. Across Blackstone, the mystery continued growing. More inmates greeted Elijah by name. More people sought his advice. Yet the older man remained exactly the same. He still read books. He still completed his assignments. He still walked through the prison as though he had nothing to prove. And perhaps that was what fascinated people most. The larger his hidden past appeared, the less interested he seemed in discussing it. As the week drew to a close, Thomas reviewed everything he had collected. The photographs, the newsletters, the recognition articles, the stories from veterans who remembered hearing Elijah's name decades earlier. The evidence pointed toward a conclusion that was becoming impossible to ignore. Elijah Carter had not simply served in the military. He had operated at a level few people ever reached. The only remaining question was how extraordinary that service had actually been. And somewhere beyond the next clue, Thomas suspected the answer was waiting. The breakthrough arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Thomas Walker had almost given up searching the library archives for the day when he noticed a box tucked behind several older shelves. The cardboard was worn with age and covered in dust. Most people would have ignored it. Thomas nearly did. But something told him to take one last look. Inside were donated newspapers, military newsletters, and community publications collected over decades. He began sorting through them slowly. Nearly an hour passed before he found anything useful. Then his eyes landed on a headline discussing a leadership conference attended by distinguished veterans. Beneath the headline was a large photograph. The moment Thomas saw it, he froze. There was no uncertainty this time. No damaged page. No blurry image. Elijah Carter stood clearly in the center of the photograph, surrounded by military leaders. Thomas read every word of the article. The details finally began connecting together. Elijah had not simply served in the military. He had been part of one of the most respected special operations communities in the country. The article described years of leadership, mentorship, and service. More importantly, it described the impact he had on the people around him. Former teammates praised his judgment. Younger service members credited him for helping shape their careers. Community leaders spoke about his dedication after leaving active duty. Thomas sat back in disbelief. Suddenly, every strange detail from the past few weeks made sense. The calm, the discipline, the ability to remain composed under pressure, the respect that seemed to follow him even from people who barely knew him. It all fit together now. Later that evening, Thomas found Elijah sitting alone in the library reading near the window. He carried the article with him. Without saying a word, he placed it on the table. Elijah glanced down and smiled softly. "You finally found it." Thomas laughed in amazement. "You knew it was out there?" Elijah nodded. "I assumed eventually someone would discover something." Thomas sat across from him. "You could have told people." Elijah closed his book. "Why?" Thomas stared at him. "Because everything would make more sense." Elijah looked out the window for several seconds before answering. "People should decide how to treat someone before they know titles, accomplishments, or history. Thomas thought about the statement. The more he considered it, the more powerful it felt. Elijah had entered Blackstone as an unknown inmate. He had given people an opportunity to reveal who they were before learning who he was. The next morning, the information spread faster than any rumor before it. By breakfast, dozens of inmates had heard pieces of the story. By lunch, nearly every housing unit was discussing it. The details varied depending on who told them, but one fact remained consistent. Elijah Carter had spent years serving at an elite level few people ever reached. The reaction across Blackstone was immediate. Conversations changed. Assumptions changed. Perspectives changed. Inmates who once viewed Elijah as an easy target suddenly reevaluated everything they thought they knew. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed the shift as well. Throughout the day, staff members mentioned Elijah during conversations. Some had already respected him because of his behavior inside the facility. Learning about his past simply reinforced that respect. Meanwhile, Ryan Cole sat at lunch listening to the growing rumors with increasing discomfort. At first, he dismissed them as exaggerations. Then more people repeated the same information. Different inmates. Different sources. The consistency made denial difficult. Ryan found himself replaying the cafeteria incident in his head. The milk. The calm response. The complete absence of anger. For the first time, he understood what had unsettled him that day. Elijah had never been intimidated. He had simply chosen not to engage. That realization landed heavily. Across the cafeteria, Elijah sat at his usual table eating lunch exactly as he always had. Nothing about him appeared different. The same calm posture. The same quiet demeanor. The same polite greetings whenever someone spoke to him. Yet the room around him had changed completely. People now watched him with a different understanding. Not because they feared him, because they finally recognized that the quiet inmate they had underestimated carried a history of extraordinary leadership and service. And although the full story had not yet emerged, Blackstone Correctional Facility had reached an important turning point. The mystery was no longer whether Elijah Carter was extraordinary. The mystery was how someone with a life like his had remained humble enough to never mention it. The atmosphere inside Blackstone changed completely after the truth about Elijah Carter's military background began spreading through the facility. For weeks, people had been trying to understand why the quiet inmate seemed different from everyone else. Now they finally had part of the answer. The discovery moved through the prison faster than any rumor in recent memory. By the end of the week, inmates from housing units Elijah had never visited were discussing him. Staff members were discussing him. Even people who normally ignored prison gossip were paying attention. Yet the most remarkable part was Elijah himself. Despite the growing attention, nothing about him changed. He still woke up early. He still reported to work assignments without complaint. He still spent time reading in the library. He still treated every person exactly the same. The respect around him grew larger while his behavior remained completely unchanged. Thomas Walker noticed it immediately. Many people would have embraced the attention. Some would have enjoyed proving doubters wrong. Elijah seemed uninterested in either. One afternoon, Thomas joined him in the recreation yard. Several inmates nearby nodded respectfully as Elijah passed. After they sat down, Thomas shook his head with amusement. "Do you realize half the prison is talking about you?" Elijah smiled. "That sounds exhausting." Thomas laughed. "Most people would enjoy it." Elijah looked across the yard. "Most people spend too much energy worrying about what others think." The answer stayed with Thomas long after the conversation ended. Across Blackstone, another person was struggling with very different thoughts. Ryan Cole had spent days watching the situation unfold. The information about Elijah's past continued spreading. Every new detail made Ryan more uncomfortable. He found himself replaying the cafeteria incident over and over again. At the time, he believed he was humiliating a vulnerable newcomer. Now he understood the situation differently. The man he targeted had faced challenges far greater than anything inside Blackstone. The milk incident no longer looked impressive. It looked childish. What bothered Ryan most was not Elijah's military history. It was Elijah's response. The older inmate had never sought revenge, never demanded respect, never even mentioned the incident. That silence forced Ryan to confront his own behavior in a way he had never expected. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer observed similar changes throughout the prison population. Tension levels seemed lower whenever Elijah participated in activities. Inmates who normally avoided educational programs had started attending more regularly. Several work supervisors reported improved cooperation. None of these developments could be attributed entirely to Elijah, yet his influence was impossible to ignore. One evening, Mercer stopped Elijah near the library entrance. "Can I ask you something?" Mercer said. Elijah nodded. "Of course." Mercer hesitated briefly. "How do you stay this calm?" Elijah smiled. "Practice." Mercer laughed softly. "That cannot be the whole answer." Elijah looked toward the hallway where several inmates were walking past. "Most people spend years reacting to circumstances. Eventually, you learn that reacting is not always necessary." Mercer considered the response carefully. Once again, Elijah managed to explain something complex using very few words. The following day brought another moment that people would discuss for weeks. During lunch, the cafeteria was crowded as usual. Conversations filled the room. Trays moved through serving lines. Then Elijah entered. Nothing dramatic happened. No announcement was made. Yet dozens of people noticed. Several inmates greeted him. Others nodded respectfully. Some simply watched quietly. The reaction spread through the room like a wave. Ryan sat frozen at his usual table, observing everything. For the first time since Elijah arrived, he fully understood what had happened. Respect had emerged naturally. Nobody ordered it. Nobody demanded it. People reached that conclusion on their own. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Across the cafeteria, Elijah collected his meal and sat alone exactly as he always had. He seemed completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. Or perhaps he noticed and simply refused to let it affect him. Either way, the effect on Blackstone was undeniable. The prison had reached a collective realization. The quiet inmate many people overlooked during his first days inside was not remarkable because of his past accomplishments. He was remarkable because of the way he carried himself every single day. And as that understanding spread through the facility, an even greater change began taking place. People were no longer impressed by Elijah's history alone. They were beginning to admire the character that history had helped build. For Ryan Cole, the attention surrounding Elijah Carter had become impossible to ignore. Weeks earlier, he had viewed the older inmate as an easy target. Now, every time he entered the cafeteria, crossed the recreation yard, or walked through a housing unit, he was reminded of how badly he had misjudged the situation. Nobody said it directly. They did not need to. The change in atmosphere spoke for itself. People no longer discussed the milk incident as a joke. They discussed it as an example of extraordinary restraint. That realization followed Ryan everywhere. One afternoon during recreation, Ryan sat alone on a bench near the walking track. It was an unusual sight. He normally surrounded himself with other inmates. Today he seemed lost in thought. Across the yard, Elijah walked slowly with a library book tucked beneath one arm. Several inmates greeted him as he passed. Elijah greeted each one with the same polite smile. Nothing about him suggested he was enjoying the attention. If anything, he appeared slightly amused by it. Ryan watched the scene unfold. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had avoided for weeks. What would he have done in Elijah's position? The answer was uncomfortable. Ryan knew he would not have shown the same patience. He would not have remained calm. He would not have handled public embarrassment with quiet dignity. The comparison forced him to confront something deeper than pride. It forced him to confront character. Meanwhile, Thomas Walker continued spending time with Elijah whenever possible. Their conversations had become one of the highlights of Thomas's week. The more he learned, the more he realized that Elijah rarely spoke about accomplishments. Instead, he spoke about principles. One evening in the library, Thomas asked a question that had been on his mind for days. Do you ever get frustrated that people only started paying attention after they learned about your past? Elijah looked up from his book and smiled. No. Thomas laughed. That answer came awfully fast. Elijah closed the book carefully. People are human. They notice titles. They notice achievements. That is normal. Thomas nodded. But it does not bother you. Elijah shook his head. What matters is what people do after they learn the truth. Thomas considered the answer quietly. Once again, Elijah managed to reduce a complicated issue into a simple lesson. Across Blackstone, Officer Daniel Mercer was noticing changes as well. Several inmates who rarely participated in educational programs had started attending classes more consistently. Work supervisors reported improved cooperation. Conflicts seemed less frequent. Mercer understood that no single person deserved credit for every positive development. Still, He could not ignore Elijah's influence. The older inmate had become an example whether he intended to or not. Later that week, Ryan finally made a decision. During lunch, he noticed Elijah sitting alone near the same table where everything had started. The sight immediately brought back memories of that first week. For several minutes, Ryan remained frozen. Then, before he could change his mind, he stood and walked across the cafeteria. Conversation slowed as people noticed where he was going. By the time Ryan reached the table, dozens of inmates were watching. Elijah looked up calmly. "Good afternoon, Ryan." The simple greeting caught Ryan off guard. There was no bitterness in Elijah's voice. No sign of resentment. Just genuine courtesy. Ryan stood there awkwardly for a moment. "Can I sit down?" Elijah nodded. "Of course." Ryan lowered himself into the chair across from him. The cafeteria remained unusually quiet. Everyone sensed something important was happening. Ryan took a deep breath. For perhaps the first time in years, he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "I have been thinking a lot lately." Elijah listened without interrupting. "About that first day?" Elijah nodded slightly. "I remember it." Ryan looked down at the table. "I was wrong." The words seemed surprisingly difficult to say. Yet once spoken, they carried a strange sense of relief. Elijah studied him for a moment before smiling. "Most people are wrong about something eventually." Ryan stared in disbelief. He expected criticism. He expected a lecture. Instead, he received understanding. Around the cafeteria, inmates exchanged amazed glances. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would be remembered throughout Blackstone. Because in that moment, Ryan Cole finally realized something that everyone else had already begun to understand. Elijah Carter's greatest strength was not his past achievements. It was the remarkable ability to offer respect even to those who had not earned it. After the conversation in the cafeteria, something subtle but important changed throughout Blackstone Correctional Facility. The story was no longer about a mysterious inmate with an extraordinary past. It was no longer about rumors, old military articles, or forgotten photographs. The story had become something much simpler. People were beginning to understand what real strength looked like. Ryan Cole understood that better than anyone. For days after speaking with Elijah Carter, he found himself replaying the conversation in his head. The words themselves were not complicated. Elijah had not delivered a speech. He had not tried to embarrass Ryan in front of the other inmates. He had not reminded anyone about the milk incident. In fact, Elijah had done exactly the opposite. He had treated Ryan with the same courtesy he showed everyone else. That was the part Ryan could not stop thinking about. One afternoon during recreation, Ryan approached Thomas Walker near the walking track. The older inmate looked surprised. The two men rarely spoke. Ryan sat down on a nearby bench. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas nodded. "Sure." Ryan looked across the yard toward Elijah, who was reading beneath a shade structure. "Has he always been like that?" Thomas smiled. "Like what?" Ryan shook his head. "Calm. Patient. Impossible to provoke." Thomas laughed softly. "From everything I have seen, yes." Ryan stared toward Elijah. "I do not understand it." Thomas followed his gaze. "Maybe because most people think strength means winning every argument." Ryan remained silent. Thomas continued. "Elijah already knows who he is. People who know who they are usually do not spend much time proving it." The words stayed with Ryan long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Elijah continued living exactly as he always had. The growing respect throughout Blackstone did not change his routine. He still volunteered his time helping inmates with educational programs. He still assisted with work assignments whenever someone needed guidance. He still spent evenings reading in the library. Yet something remarkable was happening around him. People were beginning to treat one another differently. Not everyone, not all the time, but enough to be noticed. Officer Daniel Mercer observed the shift in weekly reports. Participation in educational activities continued increasing. Several supervisors reported stronger cooperation among inmate work crews. Even minor disciplinary issues appeared to be declining. Mercer knew these improvements came from many factors, but he could not ignore Elijah's influence. The older inmate had become a living example of self-control, responsibility, and respect. One evening, Mercer found Elijah shelving books in the library. "You know," Mercer said, "people talk about you a lot around here." Elijah smiled without looking up from the shelf. "That sounds unfortunate." Mercer laughed. "Most people would consider it a compliment." Elijah placed another book into position. Attention is temporary. Character lasts longer. Mercer nodded slowly. Every conversation with Elijah seemed to leave behind something worth thinking about. Later that week, an unexpected moment occurred in the cafeteria. A younger inmate accidentally dropped his tray while carrying lunch to a table. Food scattered across the floor. Several people turned to look. The young man appeared embarrassed. Before staff could respond, multiple inmates stood up to help clean the mess. Among them was Ryan Cole. A few weeks earlier, nobody would have expected that reaction. As they worked together, Ryan noticed Elijah watching from across the room. The older man gave him a simple nod. Nothing more. Yet Ryan felt oddly proud of that small gesture. For perhaps the first time in years, he was less concerned with how others viewed him and more concerned with becoming someone worth respecting. Thomas noticed the change as well. One evening, he joined Elijah in the library and smiled. "You realize you have changed this place." Elijah looked up from his book. "No." Thomas laughed. "You absolutely have." Elijah closed the book gently. "People change themselves. They just need a reason." Thomas sat quietly for a moment considering the answer. Once again, Elijah refused to take credit. And once again, that refusal revealed exactly why so many people respected him. Because despite everything they had learned about his remarkable past, Elijah Carter remained focused on helping others become better versions of themselves. And as Blackstone continued changing around him, one final lesson was beginning to emerge. Real leadership was not about authority, reputation, or recognition. It was about the example a person set when nobody expected anything from them at all. Several months after Elijah Carter arrived at Blackstone Correctional Facility, people still talked about the changes that followed. New inmates often heard pieces of the story without realizing how much had happened since those first days. Some heard about the quiet man in the cafeteria. Others heard about the military articles discovered in the library archives. Many heard about the respect he earned throughout the facility. Yet those who knew Elijah best understood that the most important part of the story had nothing to do with his past. It had everything to do with how he chose to live each day. On a calm autumn afternoon, Elijah sat beneath the same shade structure in the recreation yard where he often read. The air felt cooler than it had during his first weeks inside Blackstone. Leaves drifted beyond the prison fences. Around him, inmates walked, talked, and enjoyed their time outside. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from the one he encountered when he first arrived. Not perfect. Prisons were never perfect. But different. More respectful. More thoughtful. More aware. Thomas Walker joined him carrying 2 books from the library. "I think I finally understand something," Thomas said as he sat down. Elijah smiled. "Only one thing." Thomas laughed. "Maybe 2. He looked around the yard. "When people first started learning about your past, they thought that was the reason everyone respected you." Elijah nodded. "That would be an easy conclusion." Thomas pointed towards several inmates helping organize recreation equipment nearby. Among them was Ryan Cole. The change in Ryan over the past few months had become impossible to ignore. He no longer searched for opportunities to dominate conversations. He volunteered more often. He treated people differently. Most importantly, he seemed at peace with himself in a way Thomas had never seen before. "But now I realize it was never about your past," Thomas continued. "Your past made people curious. Your character made people stay." Elijah looked toward the yard and smiled quietly. "That is a much better lesson." Later that evening, Ryan approached Elijah near the library entrance. The interaction no longer attracted attention the way it once would have. By now, seeing the 2 men speak had become normal. Ryan stood beside him for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to thank you." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Ryan shook his head. "For not being the person I expected you to be." Elijah laughed softly. "That is an unusual compliment." Ryan smiled. "Maybe, but it is true." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Ryan added something he had been thinking about for weeks. "The day I embarrassed myself in the cafeteria, I thought strength meant making other people feel small." Elijah listened carefully. "And now?" Ryan looked around the facility. "Now I think strength means helping people become better." Elijah nodded. "That is a lesson some people spend their entire lives trying to learn." Across the facility, Officer Daniel Mercer watched the interaction from a distance. Over the years, he had witnessed countless conflicts, rivalries, and power struggles. Very few ended the way this story had ended. Instead of resentment, there was growth. Instead of revenge, there was understanding. Instead of division, there was respect. The transformation still amazed him. As evenings settled over Blackstone, inmates gradually returned to their housing units. The yard emptied. The library closed. Another ordinary day came to an end. Before leaving, Thomas asked Elijah one final question. If you could leave everyone here with one piece of advice, what would it be? Elijah thought for a moment. Then he looked toward the fading sunset beyond the fences. Never decide someone's worth based on the chapter you happen to meet them in. Thomas repeated the sentence quietly. The words seemed simple, yet they captured everything that had happened since Elijah arrived. People had judged him before they knew him. They saw age and assumed weakness. They saw silence and assumed fear. They saw an ordinary inmate and assumed an ordinary story. They were wrong every time. And perhaps that was the real reason the entire prison seemed to freeze when the truth finally emerged. It was not because Elijah Carter had once achieved extraordinary things. It was because he never needed anyone to know. In the end, the man who earned the most respect inside Blackstone was not the one who demanded it. He was the one who quietly demonstrated, day after day, that dignity, humility, and character would always speak louder than pride. And long after the details of his past were forgotten, that lesson remained.